It's such a pleasure to be with you today and to talk about something that is so much in my heart, in my passion, and that's around funding. But specifically, we're going to focus in a lot on some of the funding that relates to school security. So we're going to talk a little bit about, give you a little bit of background with some of the funds around these recovery funds. So let's take a little walk backwards. Let's look at the different acts, when they came about, and the money that is actually attached to them. So let's talk first in March 2020, when we had the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, and we refer to that act as CARES. And in that act, there was a lot of different opportunities. There was money coming down through the governors. There was money coming down to education. There was money coming down to Treasury. So there was many different opportunities of funds that emerged as a result of that act. We're going to focus in on just one, and that is the K-12 opportunity that the CARES Act provided us. We refer to that opportunity as the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, and you probably know it as ESSER. And that first round, we often refer to that ESSER fund as ESSER 1. And notice, we got $13.2 billion. Well, folks, I've been in this business in funding for almost 50 years now, and I thought that was a windfall when we got the $13.2 billion. But then, the end of that year, in December 2020, another act happened. It was called the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act. There was a portion of it called COVID Relief. And again, ESSER received another portion of money, $54.3 billion across the nation. Now think about that. That's 4 times almost the size that we got in ESSER 1. So here we have ESSER 2. And then at the end or in March 2021 came the American Rescue Plan, ARP. And at that time, we received an additional $123 billion. That is nearly twice the amount that we got in ESSER 2. My goodness, do we have an historic opportunity in front of us to look at those dollars that are available. So let's take a look now, and let's jump right in to find out what's happening with that money. How is the spending going? So we're going to look at spending from the lens of the national lens, just like I did with the amount of funding. So under ESSER 1, we have nearly 87% of those funds approximately being spent at this point. But look at ESSER 2. We have at this point only approximately 29% of those funds that have been spent, which represents a great opportunity for us to think about how we're going to utilize and make wise choices around ESSER 2 and the little bit remaining still in ESSER 1. But in addition, we have to look at the latest round, ESSER 3, or what we refer to as ARP ESSER. And notice only a small portion of that fund around the nation is currently spent, which means there's a tremendous opportunity for educators, for our staff, for our teachers, our students, and our communities to benefit from the remaining opportunity from this ESSER. Now, there were a lot of allowable uses for ESSER, and we might get into those. You may have questions around those, but there were some key focus areas. So when the CARES Act came and we saw ESSER 2, we saw the focus areas really around learning loss, social emotional learning, and mental health. And at that point, the reopening of schools, because we were all knowing the importance of getting our buildings back and functional and operational for our students. But now as we're shifting from ESSER 2 to ESSER 3, the thought around the reopening of schools has shifted as well. We've kind of moved from spending a lot of money initially on things like PPE that we did in ESSER 1 just to get children back into the classroom. And now we're focusing in on really implementing and looking at the strategies not only to prevent, but continue to operate safe, healthy schools. And at that point, our thought process began to shift. And the thought process now has moved to that of transformation and innovation. You're going to see that throughout so much of the funding, not just in ESSER, but a lot of the discretionary or competitive funds, as well as looking at some of our other formula funds, where you're going to see the words transformation and innovation. Those are the kinds of things that the direction that we're moving in now. We know that things needed to be different, and now's the time to begin to transform and innovate for different opportunities that exist. So let's talk a little bit before we get into questions about timelines for ESSER, because this is so important, because it looks like we have a great long runway, but in reality, the timeline is starting to close in. So let's take a look at ESSER 1. You'll notice that there are two things on this chart. One says obligation date, and the other says spend date. I could say liquidation, meaning that's when the funds must leave the local school district, and we must look at the opportunity or the liquidation of those funds. So when we look at ESSER 1, we're really coming up on that timeline right now, the end of September 30th, 2022. With the liquidation date, the end of January in 2023. When we look at ESSER 2, again, the runway is a little bit longer, but still we need to be mindful of the date when it's coming. We have to obligate, meaning we need to have those purchase orders. We need to say that we are going to agree to make that purchase during this time at the end of September 2023, where the liquidation date goes out to the end of January 2024. And finally, we're looking at that ARP ESSER or ESSER 3, and we know that that obligation date is the end of September 2024, with the spend down date the end of January in 2025. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that you don't have to spend ESSER 1 before you go to ESSER 2 or before you go to ARP ESSER. We can utilize these funds to the best of our ability given these different timelines.
Yeah, we have one question out here. Does the job need to be completed by the spend date?
The job does not need to be completed. It just means that those funds must leave, and there may be different spend dates different implementation dates in order to deliver the goods and services. But those funds do need to be liquidated from the school district.
Another question, is the funding available to non-public schools?
The ESSER fund that I'm talking about presently is not the fund that is available to non-public schools. That's a great question. There's another piece of funding that I want to refer you to. It's called EAMS. It stands for Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools. So if we look at this first slide where I talked about the CARES money and I talked about the elementary and secondary school emergency relief fund, and I indicated to you that there was some additional funds. EANS was one. And EANS came through a fund called GEAR, which stands for the Governor's Education Emergency Relief Fund. So while K to 12 or our state education agencies received money, the governors under the CARES money also, or the CARES Act, also received a fund. Many of those governors used it for K-12 and higher ed. Some governors designated to put it all in higher ed, and some governors designated to put it all in K-12. It was a governor's discretion. But all governors had to set aside a portion of that money for EANS, for non-public schools. That money actually ran through the state education agency, your state Department of Education, and non-public schools had to apply for those funds. In round two, when we looked at that coronavirus, the CRRSA money, there was the GEAR money again, and this time, instead of a small portion being dedicated to EANS, there was a bigger portion of that money that went to non-public schools. Again, it went through the same pathway. So touch base with your state Department of Education, see if any of those funds are still available, because they were designated for non-public schools. When we got to the American Rescue Plan Act, the governors didn't get an allocation, but EANS did. So there was a portion of the money, again, that went to EANS, went through your state department, and those funds were then distributed by the state department's decision, and usually most of them folks did a competitive grant, and you had to apply for those funds. But just know the most important thing you can do right now is contact your non-public division at your state department and find out if any of those funds are still available.
So the first question was, what are schools spending ESSER funding on right now? And I know you kind of briefly covered that, but that was a question that came in specifically.
Good, and we really didn't cover what. We covered the amount of money, Melanie, but we really didn't qualify what are they spending on, and what has been the pattern during the times, especially as we've gotten through ESSER 1 and we're starting into ESSER 2 right now. In order to understand that each state had an ESSER plan with how those states and how that money was going to come down to local school districts. And each state across the nation highlighted some elements of it. And I want to give you the highlights of what they were addressing for what ESSER funds could be spent on. The most important one was safely reopening schools and sustaining safe operations. And we have seen since that time, when that first one happened, that a lot of groups are tracking those funds, and they're finding that districts are spending a lot of their ESSER money on facility improvements. But in addition to that safely reopening, another thing that school districts and states were very interested in making sure the money went to and was spent was addressing the academic impact of lost instructional time. Another area included supporting the educational workforce, and finally, investing in early learning. All of those were very, very important aspects of what was happening in a lot of our spending. Now, I also want to refer you, I'm going to look at this slide right now. I had a feeling this question might have come up, so I wanted to give you a resource to also go to for how folks are spending their dollars and what we know at this point. If you're familiar with AASA, it is the National School Superintendents Association. They have done surveys and they have done a great job of going out there and surveying folks, district administrators, superintendents, other ones across this nation to gauge how people are spending their money. And there's been, just like we saw with learning loss and staffing that I mentioned before, a lot of money in that area. But one of the things I want to draw your attention to, because we're on security, we're talking a little bit about security here, or at least that I told you that was going to be an emphasis that I was going to emphasize, that more than 55% are spending their dollars for renovating and updating school facilities. So I strongly encourage you to go and look at that document. It has some great information in it. But in addition to that, to even support that a little further for what they found, the Center on Reinventing Public Education also reviewed a lot of ESSER spending as well. And they looked at the largest schools, urban school districts, and the bigger school districts in order to figure out where are people spending these dollars. And this is what they found out. They're spending it on more time for extended learning, more staff. Again, there's that teacher staff shortage that we're all hearing about, and more capital spending, just like we're seeing in other reports, like we're seeing in AASA.
Still in the ESSER realm, how can we accelerate the conversion around ESSER funding?
What a great question, because we have all of these funds right now, and all of us are just trying to figure out, how do we sort them? How do we spend them? What is the way that we need to work when we're looking at this? And more importantly, who owns these funds? Because we need to understand, if we're in a position such as a facility director, safety director or coordinator, or even if you're the locksmith, all of you are so important. You have tremendous influence over these funds, but you may not be the decision maker of the funds. So who owns them? Well, the decision makers are these people, usually somebody in that upper executive level of the school district. It could be the superintendent, it could be the assistant superintendent, but it might also be a Title I director in your school district. And that is because ESSER funds follow the Title I formula. They're not Title I funds, but they follow that formula. And therefore, especially if you're in a smaller district or district that doesn't have a lot of additional staff or hasn't added somebody, it may be the Title I director. It could be a federal programs director. It could be, and we're seeing this all across the nation, we're seeing the rise of job opportunities or jobs created around the management of these recovery funds. And they have different names in different school districts. It might be somebody like an ESSER coordinator. And I would also encourage you not to forget very important people in our school districts, and that's the finance officers, because they have the knowledge about these funds. They're the ones that are going to be responsible for doing the audits and the reporting and that kind of thing around those funds. So it's important for you to understand and have a connection with these folks in order to elevate where you are right now in your position to the decision makers. The other thing before I would leave this, Melanie, I'd like to add to folks about when we're looking at the conversation around ESSER. The federal guidelines for use of these funds had 5 different questions that we need to consider as school district folks in making wise decisions for how to spend these funds. And here they are. Number 1, will the proposed use of these funds prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus? Number 2, is it an allowable use of funds under CARES, CRRSA, and under ARP? Now that kind of goes back to those emphasis of the focus funds that I told you, but in addition to that emphasis of those focus areas such as learning loss and SEL and the transformation and innovation that I talked to you about, in addition to that, there are 20 allowable uses. So we need to make sure, and those 20 allowable uses, folks, by the way, cover all 3. So it doesn't matter what ESSER program, whether it's ESSER 1, ESSER 2, or ESSER 3, it's the same allowable uses that guide those programs. So we need to make sure that what we're looking at is indeed an allowable use of funds under the ESSER program. Number 3 really goes into, is it reasonable and necessary cost? Number 4, does it promote equity? And number 5, does it support the continuation of students returning to our classroom? So as you think about your runway now, and you think about your decision makers that are responsible, also think about when you're considering the conversation and accelerating that conversation, how to look at those 5 key areas for spending.
So Paula, that prompted a question from the group online. Large projects will trigger DSA oversight and ADA upgrades. Will ESSER funds cover the DSA upgrades?
Yes, it will. And this is so, I'm so glad somebody asked that question as well, Melanie, because there is a very clear emphasis in a lot of the ESSER funds to make sure it addresses the problems we've been having currently right now for school infrastructure, as well as looking at compliance issues for students like special needs students. One of the top areas that that the U.S. Department of Education, as well as COVID commissions, has looked at is this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for health-based improvements to our school buildings and making sure that they're safe, they're evidence-based, and that the solutions that we choose provide long-term value. So with that, I'd like you to think about keeping some things in mind in light of this questioning. There's some key areas that we as decision makers or influencers need to consider around these funds in thinking about our approach to safety in our buildings. One of the areas might be in reducing the touch points, limiting the touch points in our campuses to create those healthy environments where students and teachers can resume everyday activities, to expanding the access control in every opening of our buildings, looking at them, looking at the access control to doors and windows and other areas, and making sure we allow educators to quickly and easily adapt to the functionality of our space. It's a great way right now to give you a greater emphasis on controlling the safety within your building. And then one other consideration is the aesthetics, because we're concerned, of course, with reducing the spread of germs. That's been the top priority. But schools still have so many student teacher safety issues and well-beings to consider. And because ESSER is here, it gives us an opportunity to not disrupt the learning environment, but create the flow of that environment so it is safe and secure for all students, including those students that may have disabilities.
A couple more questions have come in. My understanding is it will cover your architect fees, CM, IOR, testing, etc., as a turnkey project. Is that correct?
That is correct. And there are those fees. There's also, and I'm going to jump off into another little realm that you can utilize, that you can think about for some of those planning fees as well. So let me tell you another fund that might be out there that we can think about that could jumpstart that portion of the conversation, and then ESSER funds can then allow for the implementation of other safety needs within our building. So let me tell you about the other fund that's out there. A very important fund that folks, especially those of us in education, we tend to just look at the education dollars out there. But during all of these acts, there was another fund that was created under the Department of Treasury. Those Department of Treasury funds went to the state. They were allocated, meaning they were given to states based on a formula of need, and each state had money to give to their local jurisdictions, their county governments. Those funds, in addition to the funds that I'm talking about today, which comes from the Department of Education, can actually enhance and provide the first runway to get those plans done. And I've seen this in different states, folks, where school districts and architectural firms have worked together to get some of what is called fiscal recovery funds. The acronym is FRF. And if you need help more on this area and how much your district or county may have received, I encourage you to reach out to our sponsors today, because they have some additional, they can help you with drilling it down, so that not only will they help you with the ESSER funds and the EANS funds that we've talked about so far, and understanding how much districts receive, but they also have information on these fiscal recovery funds, because we have seen school districts utilize them in that capacity that the question was asked, in terms of architectural plans and those pre-planning things that need to happen. Those funds have to be expended first. So I encourage you to look at those funds, go talk with local and state treasury people in your state and local government, and see how, as local school districts, you might be able to tap into those funds in addition to the ESSER funds.
So there's a couple more questions coming in. I'm going to skip one and then come back to it, because the next one is on the same topic as we just talked about. Projects that will be bid out and not completed until after the spend date, the funds will not be distributed until after the spend date. If the funds are allocated, would that be acceptable?
If the funds are allocated, if you have the purchase order, if they're obligated, yes. The delivery can happen after that date. There's no way right now that, as we look at some of these projects that are going out, that we're going to complete them all for necessarily by those spend down dates. So those projects can go out. It's the same way like this, folks. You can also do multiple year contracts on these funds, provided, let me give you a qualifier here, provided it is within your state and local procurement rules. So whatever I am saying, please know that the procurement of that state, the rules and regulations of that state will guide that, because we're still under those regulations in that regard. But the allowable uses, the FAQs of these funds allow for us to expand and extend them out beyond that liquidation date. I hope that helped.
So the other question was, can the original ESSER grant be amended? And if so, how do we do that?
That's a great question. You know, when we originally received these funds, we sometimes didn't know. It's almost like a grant application, folks. When we put in our application, it was hard for us to envision where we were going. We gave it our best window of opportunity to say, we think this is what we're doing with the allowable uses. So the legislation, like all funding, does allow you to revisit what you said, like every 6 months it happens through the end of September, to really see if you need to modify or adjust what you originally said. There may be a lot of other stakeholders in your community that have voiced concerns for maybe how these funds are being spent. And there may need to be some modifications. You will need to work with your local school district as well as your state department to ensure that you meet their guidelines for any modifications. But any funder will tell you, and I'll put my funder hat on now because I used to work at the state level in doing this. Any funder will tell you, we want you to be successful. We want you to make good use of these funds. We want you to modify, if necessary, where your original intent, provided you have strong evidence and support that you need to modify what you originally intended to do with the funds.
Do we know what kind of audits will be done? Will we need photos, cost estimates, agreements?
Your fiscal person really will be the folks looking at that. And there are some varying, what I've just been looking at a lot of the reimbursement language, and it varies, this is what I will tell you, by state, by district, for looking at how you have to justify and report back on the use of those funds. I will tell you, those guiding questions that I first talked about will serve you well in making sure that on the back end that you've justified the use and the right use of those funds going forward. But I would tell you to check with your fiscal person, because they're the ones doing the audit, and they're the ones that will have the specificity that will be needed in order to help you. And that was, I have to say, Melanie, that was such a great question, because I always tell folks, begin with the end in mind. As a grants person, as a grant writer, I always begin with, okay, what are the reporting requirements? What am I going to be held up against? How do I, and then I back map from there. So the best place to do that is your finance officer.
Next question, are those 20 questions available included in this presentation? We certainly can highlight those and get them out to the people who attended this call.
Yes, and Melanie, on that vein, we've got those 20 allowable uses. We've got them aligned back to security so that you will understand how they fit in terms of the security as well. But let me tap while we're on that, Melanie, if you don't mind. Let me tap into just a few of the allowable uses, if that's all right.
Sure.
Okay. So when we're looking at the allowable uses, I wanted, there's 20 of them, like I said. I want to draw your attention to the first couple. The first one says, any activity authorized by the Elementary Secondary Education Act which was reauthorized as ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, is an allowable use. Now, what does that mean? It means that if in the past we have used funds such as Title I for low socioeconomic populations for school safety, it means we might have used Title IV, student support and academic enrichment programs, and a big portion of that money was designated around school climate and school safety. And it also means that if we used impact aid, which is the tribal and looking at those federally impacted areas where we can do construction and we get additional money for those places, any of those funds that I just mentioned, if we have used them in the past for, or if they align back to school safety, which they do, can actually be an allowable use for the ESSER funds. In addition to that, they go even further. The second one is any activity authorized by the Individuals with Disability Education Act, which is IDEA, which is our special education fund. That fund can look at anything we do to help students in terms of ADA compliance. So think broad, think flexibility around these funds. I just highlighted two, but right there, we could stop right there and say, we know school security fits.
Does receipt of the funds result in any encumbrances on facilities? For example, if I secure a grant for physical security, are we required to keep the school open for a number of years or disallow us to, say, sell the facility?
The important thing there, and I'm going to draw people back to the intent of these funds, the intent of the funds, the ESSER funds, was to reopen and continue the facility operations. That is the purpose, one of the biggest purposes of these funds. By accepting the funds and by signing that you are in agreement with those funds, you are agreeing in actuality to keep those buildings open and to keep things on track and moving forward. Beyond that, in terms of the question itself, I would not be at all telling you Paula is a legal person and legal guidance. I will tell you from my experience, my skill set in this area, and 50 years of doing funding, what I understand. But I would direct the person asking that question to please check out with their legal counsel to make sure that that language, when you accept, is indeed meets or could raise a red flag if things happen. Because we all, and that was a great question, because we all need to be aware that by accepting funds, this is an agreement, and we need to adhere to the terms of that agreement. So I would tell you in that regard, seek legal counsel or the wisdom of somebody that from your school district.
Our school district is in the process of compiling our needs assessment for consolidated funds. Can you help me address some of the needs around safety that I should include?
Good question. Very good. Right now, as I'm speaking, from April to May, all the school districts all around this nation right now are conducting or compiling their needs assessment for the use of their funds, their regular funds, as well as thinking about ESSER and these recovery funds as well, because we need to think about how do we braid all of this together. So they're doing throughout the nation right now their needs assessment. And here's where I'm going to direct everyone to look at this extremely valuable resource to help you and guide you with that needs assessment as you're going through it right now. There is a group called the Partner Alliance for Safer Schools. The acronym for it is PASS. And they provide a really comprehensive approach to looking at school environments and looking at what has worked, what has not worked, and helping you think about making informed decisions. While they're guiding you through that, they have outstanding, extensive checklists, more than I would ever be able to convey in this presentation, to help guide you to think about what goes in your needs assessment. How do I craft this needs assessment so I am ensuring the safety and well-being of our students in our buildings? Please, folks, it's a great document. You can download it. I know that Melanie and others on the team, their sponsors today, know about them. They would be happy to provide you some additional insight, but utilize that information. It's powerful.
Great, thank you, Paula. Looking through the list here. What about E-rate funds, and can they be used for school safety?
Ooh, E-rate is a big area, and we look at it as sometimes, can we get these funds? Can we do this? So first of all, let me tell you, I've done a lot of work with E-rate over the years. I've also done a lot of even writing and authoring with some other groups around E-rate. And not too long ago, some of you may be familiar with a publication, a journal called District Administrator. They did a survey around E-rate. And when that survey came out, what it said is we're not taking full advantage of these E-rate funds. E-rate is one of the largest educational technology programs in the country. And it helps both schools and libraries through what is called the Universal Service Administration Company, or USAC. Now, over the years, how E-rate funds are applied for has made it a little difficult sometimes and a little cumbersome for us to really get those funds, receive those funds, and use those funds. Primarily, E-rate is around making broadband more affordable and more accessible throughout our nation. One of the elements that has created a little confusion lately is a streamlined portal that is used called Epic. And it streamlines how you go about utilizing these funds. What I would tell you is there is a great resource, an unbelievable resource. They've been around for years. I've known them for a long time. They are wonderful in helping schools and school districts navigate the E-rate space, looking at Category 1 and Category 2, and ensuring how you can take full advantage of those funds. And that group is called Funds for Learning. They also can navigate, provided it is within the realm of that broadband kind of understanding, special construction charges such as the design, the engineering, the project management, and the construction costs, again, related back to broadband. So please take a look at Funds for Learning. They certainly can guide you through that. There's two other groups that I would tell you that are always looking at E-rate as well and have great information. I've worked with both of them. And most of your technology directors within your school district know the first one, and that's called CETA, the State Education Technology Directors Association, and COSIN. Both of them, the Consortium of School Networking, both of them are very, very active in understanding about E-rate. In the American Rescue Plan, we got some additional money for E-rate programs for home internet access and connectivity fee devices. And it was $7.2 billion that was added to the current E-rate. So go to Funds for Learning, check out your CETA person within your school district, talk with people at COSIN, get on their website. All of them will be great resources when you're looking at E-rate. One other thing before I leave it, and this kind of goes back to the school safety question. At the end of E-rate, there is a kind of a reimbursement of funds that didn't get spent. They're actually called, it's called BEAR. I can't remember what it billable something. I can't remember the rest of the acronym off the top of my head. But the BEAR process actually allows for, if any of those funds haven't been spent, if you can connect it back to technology in some way, you can actually might be able to tap into some of that money in terms of school safety. But it's kind of a catch-all at the end that we may be able to do things with in terms of school safety as well.
I've got a couple more I would like to try to squeeze in before the end of our time here. The first one is, some schools have had a decrease in enrollment due to the pandemic. How do you expect that to affect 2023 funding?
You know, we're seeing this all across the nation right now, Melanie. It's such a good question because enrollments are beginning to decline. We saw them really accelerate at the beginning of the pandemic, and we're still seeing those declining areas. I want to remind you all that most of the money for K-12 education comes from state and local sources. And local sources is primarily based on property taxes, and state funding is based on a formula that considers a number of factors, such as the number of students enrolled in each district. And states often use the prior year enrollment to allocate the funding. So if we think about that, that indeed may equate to the consequences of funding levels where students are not in classes. One of the things some folks are being looked at is a new funding formula in different states that is more accurately and equitably measured. And there was some funding not too long ago, it was last year, I think, out, which allowed for states to begin to study that and look at different funding mechanisms that they were going to use rather than just the declining enrollment that may have happened. So I tell you, it's a hard one to answer right now because we will probably see a decline in state and local funding. I can tell you that there's a little bit of an uptick in some of the federal dollars coming down. But again, a lot of our federal dollars, especially like Title I and IDEA, are also attached to the number of low socioeconomic or special needs students that we have as well.
What I found interesting was, I've heard there's funding available to implement measures to eliminate vaping in schools. What are those funds?
Oh, what a good question. This fund has been out for a long time, and I don't think many of us think about this, but since 1998, 46 states and the District of Columbia forced kind of major tobacco manufacturers to provide payments to the states. Now look, listen, this settlement is huge. It's about $206 billion every year for 25 years. Presently, just like we're seeing some things with other areas, we're seeing some of that money, not necessarily always, depending on the state, when they receive that money, going to the health and prevention for things like vaping. Now's the time to make your voice known. It's very important because that's kind of the intent when those dollars came down. In fact, there is a state-by-state analysis that was done. It's a large report. It's called Broken Promises to Our Children, a state-by-state look at the tobacco settlement. It really is a great resource to understand what's been happening with these dollars. Much like I told you with some of the other funds, such as the Fiscal Recovery Fund, the ESSER funds, the EAMS funds that we've been talking about today, we actually work with Allegiant to track those tobacco settlement funds as well. So if you want some additional information for how much your state received, please reach out because they have that information as well.
So in the same vein, there's funding to deal with opioid issues as well. What funding is that?
Okay. It's called the Opioid Overdose and Prevention Initiative. And the end of December 2021, we began to see this money starting to flow from legal settlements that happened from the manufacturers, from distributors, from pharmacies, and ever start to flow to our state and local governments. Now, Johns Hopkins University has done a lot with helping people think about the use of these funds because they studied what happened during the tobacco settlement that I told you about, the broken promises, and they're trying to ensure that these funds are directed to spend money on to save lives, to use evidence around solutions that you're thinking about spending, to invest in the whole youth prevention around this, to focus on racial equity, and develop some fair and transparent processes for deciding how to spend those funds. They're just now starting to flow. We are also starting to see through Health and Human Services and other organizations some competitive grants coming out on this. So we are seeing some things such as there's opioid response grants, there's tribal grants, there's rural communities grants, all around this particular issue. Those are competitive, separate from the other settlements that are coming down to state and local governments.
Great, Paula. We're right at time. We really appreciate everyone joining us and all of your questions. And we hope you found this informational. If you continue to have questions about funding or solutions or past, please contact your Legion security consultant in your area. You could always get in, our website has a contact us if you don't know who that is. You can do us.allegiant.com/school security, and you'll go to the school security section of our website, which has our contact us. And we are happy to help you navigate this, get questions to Dr. Love if we all don't have the answers. But we hope you found this useful and educational, and we really thank you for your time. Paula, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise today. And everyone have a great day. Thank you.